Now let's go back to Edinburgh. Professor Peter Higgs has started responding to questions as a result of that Nobel Prize for Physics that he was awarded earlier in the week. Let's listen in.
Another question there.
Can I ask, Professor, how did you actually hear the news, though? Because we understand you don't have a mobile phone. Did somebody tell you, in wherever you were in Leith, or how did you actually hear?
How did you hear the news?
Well, curiously enough, I heard the news when I was returning from my lunch in Leith later in the afternoon, and I was walking along Heriot Row when a car pulled up across the road near the railings. A lady in her 60s or maybe 70 or so got out and introduced herself as a former neighbour and widow of a judge who died recently, and congratulated me on the news. And I said, "Oh, what news?" And so she told me that her daughter had phoned from London to alert her to the fact that I had got this prize. And I heard more about it, obviously, when I got home and started reading the messages.
How do you feel about winning the prize?
How do you feel about winning the prize?
How do I feel? Well, I'm obviously delighted and rather relieved that, in a sense, it's all over, because it's been a long time coming. Maybe I should mention that as long ago as 1980, an old friend who happened to work in Sweden visited Edinburgh and told me that from a colleague of his in physics, he'd learned I'd been nominated for the prize. So I was already then, in 1980, alerted to the possibility. In terms of later events, it seemed to me that for many years that the experimental verification might not come in my lifetime, but since the start-up of the LHC, it's been pretty clear that they would get there, and despite some mishaps, they did get there. So after July last year, it seemed to be just a question of which year. Last year would have been premature, because the announcement from CERN in July last year simply said they had found a Higgs-like particle. In the spring of this year, they firmed that up and called it a Higgs particle. So then it was really tied up experimentally, and I think at that stage the prize was probably on its way.
Next question, there's one here. Yeah. Okay. Could you either perhaps move out to the side, please, the photographers?
Hi, Michael Glacken from The Times. You've mentioned, Professor Higgs, that you're obviously delighted at getting the prize. Did you celebrate in any specific way when you heard the news? Or have you celebrated yet?
The celebration?
Have you celebrated
yet? There was a celebration of a group of us last night after a lecture by Frank Close. That was certainly a start, and I shall be celebrating with my family with the help of a bottle or two of champagne early this evening. It hasn't been possible to get us all together before that.
I should say that when we came back from CERN last year, Peter refused to have some Prosecco on the plane, and he had a can of London Pride instead. So before this evening, Peter...
Thank you.
Let me add, we are not being sponsored by Pride, no, although we might be prepared to discuss sponsorship with them. So the next question, please. I think the lady there.
Rebecca McQuillan from the Herald. I'm just wondering, the prize has obviously catapulted you to a new level of fame. How do you feel about having that level of international recognition?
You have been catapulted to a new level of fame. How do you feel about your new celebrity status?
Well, I think I face the immediate future with some foreboding because having experienced the wave of attention which followed the announcement at CERN in July 2012, I anticipated that this last announcement would trigger, an order of magnitude more attention. So I think I'm going to have difficulty in the next few months having any of my life to myself.
So, the lady at the back, yes.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Guo Chengji from China's Xinhua News Agency. My question is, when you heard the news of winning the prize, did it make you have a bigger appetite while you are having your lunch? And another question is, as the CERN confirmed the existence of the Higgs boson, do you think CERN should also win the prize? Thank you.
Okay.
There are two parts.
So, the first question is whether you had an increased appetite when you heard the news, but I think the point was that Peter didn't hear the news until after he had had lunch. Yes. So it might have aided his digestion, but it didn't aid his appetite. But the specific question is whether you think CERN should receive a prize for the discovery.
Well, clearly they should, but I think it's going to be even more difficult for the Nobel Committee to allocate the credit when it comes to an organisation like CERN. More difficult than it was for them to decide which theorists to award the prize to. I should remind you that although only two of us have shared this prize, Francois Anglaire of Brussels and myself, that the work in 1964 involved three groups of people, two in Brussels. Unfortunately, Robert Brout died a few years ago, so is no longer able to be awarded the prize, but he would certainly have been one of the winners if he'd still been alive. But there were three others who also contributed, and it is already difficult to allocate the credit amongst the theorists, although a lot of people seem to think that I did all this single-handed. It was actually part of a theoretical program which had been started in 1960, and the man who really initiated it was Yorikiro Nambu, originally from Japan, who is now back in Japan, and he was awarded a share of a prize in 2008. So it's part of a story which goes back at least to 1960, and 1964 was just what turned out to be a rather successful episode in that story.
Can I add to that? I think that other organisations don't have the same rules, and Peter will be receiving an award from the Prince of Asturias Foundation in October. That's from the Spanish royal family, and CERN is sharing that with Peter and Francois Anglaire. So CERN is being recognised, and that prize will be accepted for CERN on behalf by the Director General. So there have been occasions when CERN have been rewarded. It's just that the Nobel Committee's rules don't allow it.
So here, there's a question here first.
Gillian Bowditch from the Sunday Times. Given that very generous answer, Professor Higgs, should the Higgs boson be renamed to incorporate perhaps Professor Anglaire? And also my second question is, what are the practical applications of the discovery of the Higgs boson? I mean, what is possible now that wasn't possible before?
On the question of names, I think renaming it is I mean, it may end up just being identified by a Greek letter or something of that sort. The attention has been mostly on this particle because discovering it was really vital to checking that the whole theoretical structure was correct. But really, I think the important breakthrough in 1964 by the group of theorists was what is now being called the Brout-Englert-Higgs mechanism, which is the way in which mass is generated for the particles which carry the weak force between elementary particles. And that which originally, as a result of some accidents, had my name attached to it rather unfairly, is generally, I think, referred to as the Brout-Englert-Higgs mechanism. When it comes to the particle, the problem is that there was a much more explicit reference to it in a paper which I wrote. Somewhat ironically, the reference to it was put in a second version because the first version of the paper had been rejected. So it's rather accidental that my name is attached to the particle, but I perhaps, simply because I drew attention to it, have a stronger connection than the others. So, I mean, getting rid of the name Higgs boson will probably be difficult. As for the second question, the practical applications, well, you can't really use this thing for much because it lasts an extremely short time. When it's said to be discovered at CERN, what is discovered is in fact the tracks which result from what it decays into in a very short time. So it's not the sort of thing that you can easily make a beam of and use for bombarding tumours or something of that sort. And the consequence of the discovery is much more in terms of what is beyond the present generation of experiments in CERN, the kind of thing which will be done when the machine starts up again in 2 years' time. And the hope and expectation is that the further discoveries for which the so-called Higgs boson gives maybe possibly some hints will give us more insights into a relation of particle physics and so it's not something
that's slightly frustrating, isn't it? We were hoping to bring you a little bit more, Professor Peter Higgs, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, of course, but sadly for a brief period at least, we seem to have lost the line to Edinburgh University, but there you saw his first public reaction to the award by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences that he jointly shares now with the Belgian Francois Englert.
And very self-deprecating it was too. If you were with us at the moment where he was describing how he first heard about his Nobel Prize for Physics, he said he was walking along the road in Leith, along Heriot Row, and a neighbour jumped out of a car and stopped him and said, "Congratulations." And he said, "Well, congratulations for what?"
It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah. The existence, of course, the so-called God particle, that's what some of the questioning there was entering into, said to give matter its substance or its mass. It was proved 50 years on, of course, and this is the reason for the award by this team from the European Nuclear Research Facility. You heard reference there to the CERN facility in Geneva, Switzerland, in 2012. And as I mentioned, he shares the prize with the Belgian Francois Englert. And it's quite interesting to look at the ranks of some of the past winners of that particular Nobel Prize for Physics. They include Marie Curie and Albert Einstein, to name but two, and there are one or two pretty luminous names to add to that list as well.